We have another question here. It says, I have heard not all content on my website is good for SEO. Can you explain what content might be bad for my SEO? It's a great question. So a couple different rules of thumb, and this is nothing that this is just Google best practices. A couple different things you want to be aware of. One of the things that Google looks out for and does not benefit you the way that it can is what they would call thin content. Like THIN, thin content. And what that means is content where Google views it as somebody that's trying to game the system, if you will. You're trying to create a lot of pages or posts on your website that are maybe specific to a particular geographic area or some product or services, but you're not putting a whole lot there. So there's not a lot of words or whatever. You're just creating a page and SEOing that page to try to get a Google result. But there's not a lot of meat and potatoes there. There's just basically the titles and things like that. So one of the things you want to think about is Google typically looks for content that's over 300 words to surpass what they would consider maybe like the thin content threshold. Now, ideally, it would be over 600 words, and there's even studies that are out there that say the more words, the better. So over 1,000 words, even the better. But what you want to avoid is trying to have content on your website where you don't have a lot of words. You have less than 300 words, because Google's going to view that in a way that you're trying to create a bunch of content that's SEO'd, but it's not legitimate. You're not really putting in the time to create the content. You're just trying to game the system. So again, they call that thin content. So if you're going to put content on your website, whether it's a project portfolio, a news article, anything like that on your website, be thinking in lines of 300 words plus. And the more, the better. If it's 600 words, that much better. But try to make sure you're not going to be below that 300 word threshold. Now, again, if you think about that, you might be like 300 words, that's kind of a lot. But again, in a lot of content, you're going to give people information on how to contact you and a variety of different things. So, you can get to 300 words, if you spend a little bit of time to do that. And it's not too hard. If you have something to write about and then you include contact information, things like that, you can get there. But again, think about it as 300 words is the minimum. And ideally, if you can get over 600 words, all the better. So that's one thing you want to avoid on your website if you're adding content, is thin content. The other thing you want to avoid is what's called duplicate content. And that's web content on your website where you have the same content in numerous spots on your website. So you're duplicating a page in an effort to try to get to act like there's more content on your website than there is. Now, there are ways you can create location pages and things like that on your website and do it in such a way to where you would have blocks of text that aren't duplicated. They're being displayed from one common location. So from a viewer standpoint, you see all the text, but it's not duplicated. What you want to avoid, and what it's always good to think about it from Google's perspective, what they're trying to avoid by having these situations in place. What they don't want somebody to do is to try to game the system by, say, taking a page about a product or service and duplicating it 100 times to give Google the impression that there's 100 pages of content there, when the reality is there's only one page of content. And then, maybe they tweak one or two things on that page to make that page seem different, but in reality, it's basically 95% the same page. Google would view that as negative or duplicate content, and they would not give you any credit for those other pages. So you can go through the process. There's a lot of talk that's been out there about, is there a duplicate content penalty? Everything I've read tells me that there's not necessarily a duplicate content penalty, i.e., does Google negatively rate your website if you have duplicate content? They just don't give you any positive thing for having the duplicate content. So you can go through a lot of work to create this duplicate content and not get any positive benefit from it. So don't think about it as Google's going to penalize you as much for having the duplicate content. It's just a waste of your time is what it is. So always try to have enough fresh content. If you want to have pages for locations and things like that, talk a little bit about that location. Create, use different pictures on that location. Create enough of a difference in that page to where it's not viewed by Google as being duplicate content. Tim asks, how important is it to have great speed on your website? I'm looking at a bunch of big sites, and there's a speed test is low too. A lot of people talk about getting your site fast, but you lose so much to do that. Tim, site speed is definitely part of what Google looks at with regard to search engine optimization. Again, there's a balance there of having, the content you want and your website display the way you want it to with regard to having fast. What you want is, you have to make sure you're doing the things you can to have your website respond quickly. If somebody goes to pull up your website and it's a blank screen for several seconds before it even starts to populate your website, that's a problem. Your website can always be faster, and you can start to lose a little bit of the context. And I think the content is you're getting to by trying to just solely focus on speed. So we try to look at a balanced approach. It's not all about speed, but your website can't be slow and sluggish either. Now, there's a couple things that impact speed. One would be your site structure, like how your website was built, the size of files that are on your website. A lot of times when you consider that 80+% of your website web traffic is being consumed on mobile, you don't have to have a 5 megabyte size picture on your website to display properly on mobile. So a lot of people just use images that are way too big. So it causes your website to be sluggish to show the website because their files are way too big. So they can minimize those files and still get just as good of a user experience because the size of a 800 kilobyte file looks just as good on mobile and even desktop as the 5 megabyte file, and you've reduced that file by over 80%. So you want to look at things like that you can do to keep the user experience good and increase your site speed. The other thing is to look at your hosting platform. A lot of people just naturally go with the cheapest hosting platform. You go with one of the big names and you go with their $9.99 a month or $12.99 a month package. But typically what that's going to be is your website's going to be put on a shared server with a lot of other websites. And depending on what the traffic is with those other websites, it could impact how fast or how slow your website loads as well. So I would recommend spending for a premium hosting service that's going to put you on a faster server with more RAM, more cache, all those things like that, so that you could actually, your website is not being shared by as many other websites and it can serve your website faster, number one. The other thing, which is a little bit of a sidebar to that, is make sure your website has an SSL certificate, which also impacts both user experience and search engine results. And an SSL certificate, depending on the type of service you have, may be included in the package, or it may be another $5 to $10 a month. So typically what you want to be looking at is a situation where you have a balance of page speed and user experience. Because if you have a horrible user experience, but your website's fast, that's not necessarily a great thing either, because people are going to arrive at your website, not see what they're looking for, or not have a good experience and bounce out of there. And if a lot of people are bouncing out of your website, that could be a negative SEO thing as well. So everything in balance is what we try to look at. It's not all one direction. You've got to look at a lot of different things, and it's got to be a well-rounded website.